Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Welcome to this STARS webinar. I'm Tony Schönenberger, I'm the Executive Chairman of STARS. STARS is a global platform for dialogue to discuss developments which will impact our society as a whole, and particularly our businesses and organizations in the next couple of years. In this context, I'm pleased to inform you that STARS is preparing two symposia in Singapore and in Switzerland in 2026, plus a study tour to China, to Shenzhen, and a study tour to Romania, to Bucharest. Please visit our website for more information. No doubt, geopolitical and geoeconomic and geotechnological intelligence is a must for any leader in business and society. So today we are starting a new webinar series. Complexity is destiny, orientation in times of no direction. And today we have the great privilege to talk to Volker PERTHES. Welcome, Volker. Great to have you on this webinar.
Thanks, Tony. Always a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Volker PERTHES was the director of the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin, and he is now senior advisor to this institute, which is the leading think tank in Germany. Volker, in addition to that, was the chairperson of the ceasefire task force of the International Syria Support Group. He was the UN Under-Secretary General for Sudan in 2021 to 23, and I'm very proud to say that he's also a member of the STARS Scientific Board. So Volker, we are very much looking forward to your insights. We have 30 minutes to discuss with Volker PERTHES. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature below to type in your questions. And I would like to encourage you to do it quickly because we are running out of time very fast. So let's start, and I have the privilege to ask the first question. Now, the title is Complexity is Destiny. If we look at the world today, perhaps at the crazy world today, a forward-looking tracking of geopolitical, geoeconomic, and again, geotechnological dynamics is needed. Volker, what worries you most these days?
Look, when you ask about my nighttime sleep, there are probably 4 or 5 issues here. See, and they all are linked together. They're all connected. The first is definitely order, global order, you could call it, or international order, which is the arrangements and institutions and norms that make it possible for us to interact in a civilized way as states, but also as non-state actors. And this order, there's nothing new. This order is under pressure. It's under pressure as a result of power diffusions in the world. More countries, more states, more actors have more power. It's not unilateral as it used to be, or bilateral. It's multipolar, that world. We have a weakening of checks and balances in some member states, and on the global level, we have the feeling of many people. You will realize that when you travel to regions, many people in many regions, that the system doesn't really work for them, and that they're using for alternatives, and that is feeding a sort of populism, which some actors are actually using to lead a backlash against established orders also in their home countries. And the second phenomenon, which is very closely linked, is the challenges to multilateral cooperation, or to the multilateral system where all states, on the basis of certain agreed rules, work together as equals, legally as equals, despite their differences in size and power. And we see that institutions like the UN Security Council have been blocked as a result of great power conflict, that the UN is being undermined by its own members, actually, that norms which the UN has been defending, like sustainability, human rights, are coming under pressure. And also And that's what I've been working with in the last couple of years, that peace operations by the United Nations are drawn down, new ones are not established, and conflicts just rage on as it happens in Sudan, for example, and the UN is largely sidelined. Closer to home, and that would be, I guess, my third point is we have seen war coming back to Central Europe. We thought we had banned war from Europe, except perhaps from some of the peripheries, which was bad enough, but now it is in the middle of Europe again. And there is a real risk that this war, which we have in Ukraine since the full Russian invasion of that country, would be expanding. I'm not speaking of a world war or anything like that. I'm not into catastrophe scenarios, but it could expand, and Europe could slide into something like a semi-permanent conflict or semi-permanent tensions and conflict with a lot of hybrid confrontation. And of course, we know that's not good for our societies. That's not good for our economy. Neither is it good for our ability to influence developments in the rest of the world, which brings me to my fourth point, which is Europe itself. I think if we look at the discussions that have been taking place in Brussels, also at the cautious but visible attempts of the UK, of the British government to realign with Europe on geostrategic issues. The same goes for Norway and others. We see that the Europeans, I would say, have realized that there are challenges, that they need to adapt, that they need to be more competitive, not only in economic, in their own economic setup, but also geopolitically. But any change processes, particularly if you have 27 countries involved or even more, is slow, and people are not necessarily patient. So we are moving forward, but we are moving forward very slowly, and there is a constant discussion about where the costs will fall. And as we know, nation states try to blame the union for reforms that may hurt. This last point is then paralleled by political developments in our own countries, which do concern me. You asked for my concerns, challenges to democracy, challenges to the legitimacy and the functioning of democratic system, and also as a result, challenges to the internal cohesion of societies in Europe and to their resilience. And when we speak of challenges to democracy, we usually look to the United States, where it sort of begins. If we speak of big democracies, we see a democratically elected president who is about to establish something which we could call an absolute presidency. We have known absolute monarchs in Europe. We have had very benign monarchs too, but once you have absolute power in a monarchy or absolute power in a presidency, it is what others have been saying: absolute power corrupts absolutely. And we're seeing an absolute presidency here, which is elected, definitely, but does away with all the checks and balances, or tries to do away with all the checks and balances, uses the instruments of state power to go against its enemies. Even speaking of the enemy within, we know that I'm actually much more concerned about the domestic developments in the US than about their international policies. I may distinguish myself here a little bit with some of the other commentators. But what we see is that internationally, on an international level, there are checks and balances. The US cannot do everything alone. The world is multipolar. They are checked by China, by Europe, by the global South. So what we have to look at is what happens internally, and we always know that domestic developments in the US at some point will sort of migrate to Europe. Is Europe immune against these challenges to democracy? It certainly is not. It does have defenses, but nothing is guaranteed. And the challenge is for our policymakers. They need to deliver, and they need to be transparent on the challenges with which we see domestically and internationally. And let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Volker. We will come back to some of your points. I would just like at this point in time to encourage everybody to ask the questions, and please use the Q&A function below. Before opening the questions or opening the floor, I would really like to come back to the Middle East. I mentioned it before, Volker is the expert on the Middle East, and he just returned actually from Qatar. Now we have the Trump peace plan, so to say, and that seems to be a kind of a new beginning for the region, for the whole of the Middle East. Is this really historic? Is it a real vision or a strategy to bring about peace and prosperity to the region?
Look, let me try to be realistic here. It's certainly so that what is now called the Trump plan is a first plan beyond simply going for a ceasefire since 7 October 2023. So it has been 2 years of war. Wouldn't have been necessary, we all know that. And what we had before have been arrangements, proposals, initiatives for ceasefire, but without any political perspective. So that's a new thing. Is it a Trump plan? Well, if it helps, we can call it like that. It contains actually a lot of ideas that come from a lot of players, particularly, you mentioned Qatar, particularly from the Arab countries. Egypt, Qatar have played a major role here in devising plans, and that has been accumulated in the Trump administration and presented as a Trump plan. I'm happy to call it like that if it helps. Now, it seems for now that it has helped to end the fighting and slaughtering in the Gaza Strip, and that is good enough to celebrate it, but we cannot rest on that. So as positive as his plan was, the more concerning it is when we listen to President Trump's rhetoric that he has actually ended a 3,000 years war. That is what he said in Sharm el-Sheikh, which could lead policymakers, particularly in the Middle East, but also in Israel and even Palestinians, say, okay, everything is solved. Now we go back to business as usual, which means that we're not going to solve the complicated questions. Yes, we have a ceasefire. We may even have an international stabilization force there, and we will have negotiations, and they can drag on for the next 5 years, 10 years, and the political perspective will be lost. Let us remind ourselves what this conflict is about. It is about land, of course. It is about security, particularly for Israel and for the Jewish people, and it is about self-determination, particularly for the Palestinians. You can have it all, a division of the land, of the territory, security for both, self-determination for both, but you have to work for it. You need a political perspective where, in the end, you speak about statehood. Now, the plan says that at the end of the road, there should be a path to statehood condition. It's good that this is in the plan. We only have to make sure that the US president and other global powers continue to put pressure both on the Israelis and on the Palestinians, particularly Hamas, to walk forward on this path. Otherwise, the plan will be forgotten after a couple of years and we will have a next round of violence. Let me say one thing more about why it happened now, or why I think it happened. The plan, in essence, there's not much new into it, and it doesn't have to be so. We have seen that in many peace processes around the world, that you can have a plan that makes sense, tabled once, twice, 3 times, and no one takes it. And then comes a moment where suddenly the parties are prepared to work with it. And this is what we have here. President Trump, in my reading, is not a good negotiator or deal maker. I wonder whether he's a negotiator in the first place. But he's a very experienced bully. He knows when to push you over the line. He knows when you are weak enough that you have to accept a compromise. And here we have had a situation, and I think he sensed that this was his chance to push Netanyahu a little. Here we had a situation where the military in Israel has told their prime minister there's nothing more to win militarily. I mean, you can bomb a house once or twice or three times, it will only be destroyed once, right? You don't win more. 90% of the infrastructure is already destroyed. So what more do you win? We have two societies, the Israeli and the Palestinian, who are tired of war, who want it to stop. Israel has been more and more isolated in the world. I mean, even the German chancellor, who is certainly a strong friend of Israel, has stopped arms deliveries that could be used in Gaza. So that was a moment where it only needed, as it seems, a little push to make both Israel and Hamas accept that deal. And it was the Arab countries that worked on, plus Turkey, that worked on Hamas, and it was Trump that worked on Netanyahu.
How do you see then, or what is your vision of the Palestinian state? Would that include Gaza and the West Bank, or how do you see that actually?
Well, it has to. It has to involve these two Palestinian population centers. You have 3 million or so Palestinians in the West Bank, 2 million or so in Gaza. And if we go back to the Oslo agreements and agreements that followed, and if we go back even to 67 and the war then, this is a territory, or these are two territories which are not part of Israel. They haven't been independent. They were under Jordanian or Egyptian administration before 67, but it was accepted that these were Palestinian territories, whoever administered them concretely. So that is what is to be built upon. And then you have to speak about the details, the exact borders, the question what happens with Israeli inhabitants in that region who have built settlements there. And I mean, even during the last 2 years, when there was heavy fighting and slaughtering and a lot of cruelties and violations of international human rights law in Gaza, we had Israeli and Palestinian interlocutors like the former Israeli Prime Minister Olmert and Mr. Kidwa from the Palestinian side, who came together and said, well, we can devise a plan. I mean, even with all the settlement building, even with all the destruction, it's still possible to find a territorial solution. Now, ideally, as a Western liberal Democrat, I would say, why don't the two people live together in one state and everybody has a vote and it could be a Democrat? This will not happen. Not after the wars we had, certainly not after the last one. There is a real wish on both sides to separate. Now, do the Israelis or many Israelis want to separate from the Palestinian people, but not from the territory? Yes, that's right. Do a lot of Palestinians wish that the Israelis or the Jews would simply vanish from the historical area of Palestine? Yes, that's certainly true. But in the end, you have to find a way to live together, which I think is living side by side in two different entities. You can, of course, and I guess we will get into that discussion in the next 1, 2, 3 years. You can think about creative solutions like confederations involving Jordan, for example. But you need to have two entities where you have self-determination and security for both people.
Hmm. Another country I would like to mention is obviously Iran in the Middle East. Iran seems to be the big loser after these couple of years. What are you expecting there?
Look, geopolitically, they are the big loser. There's no question. They had a geopolitical project, which they call the axis of resistance, an axis which would extend from Tehran through Baghdad, through Damascus until Beirut. This axis has been destroyed with the force of Israeli arms and a little bit of American help at the end. Their nuclear program has been bombed and seems to be not functional right now. So yes, there is a geopolitical defeat. They have lost their influence over Damascus, over Lebanon. But the art of politics, of course, is to turn geopolitical defeats into political victories. And And I think there is a chance for Iran, they have to take it, to say, okay, we failed with that geopolitical project. Now let's concentrate on rebuilding our country, building our economy, getting the young people to support a reconstruction project, which is a societal and economic reconstruction project. And that is what the majority of Iranians who went to the vote have elected President Pezeshkian for. He said, we want to get out of the sanctions. We want to settle our relations with the US and with others. Vote for me. That is what people voted, what people elected him for. So he has to deliver now. And I think there is a real chance.
Mm. There is a question from Marcus Brandini. As a company leader, how should or could I align my corporate strategy in regard of these many unforeseen and unpredictable developments?
Yeah, it's a pertinent but also a difficult question, and I guess I can only give a response very much in general terms. The one thing is, I guess, long-term thinking. I mean, don't be too much diverted from your long-term goals and strategies by these very quick geopolitical shifts. You cannot plan them. You cannot plan for them anyway. But you will know that China will be there in 1,000 years, and the US will be there uh, at least in 100 years, and Europe will be there, and even Russia will be there. We also know that Africa will grow, that we look at demographic trends. That's probably the only trend which you really can plan for. So think about the long term. And the second recommendation I would give, I don't know which industry Marcus is working in, but many industries, from finance to steel melters, so the whole spectrum, over the last couple of years have accepted the sustainability agenda of the United Nations, which is under pressure now, particularly from the Trump administration. So also I would think if you plan for the long term, don't give up what you all realized at some point was the right thing to do. Don't let yourself be corrupted by a president who has another 3 years to go, or by governments who are emulating him in Europe or anywhere else.
In this context, there is a question from Bruno Gehrig. How do you see the role of Turkey between the powers in the area of the Middle East and even Europe?
Again, here, I wouldn't want to speak too much about Erdogan and his manipulation of Turkish democracy, or how long he will stay in power and how good his health is. For me, Turkey is important because it's there, and because it's big, and because it has a position in the geography of Europe and close to the Middle East, which cannot be ignored. So for Europe, we know it's a difficult partner, but there are more difficult ones around the European Union. So we have to try to get the best possible working relationships with Turkey. At the same time, we may want to take the influence we have on Turkey to not, let's say, overextend their influence, or try to overextend their influence in the Middle East, because that has usually been firing back against them. We see that in the north of Syria. We see that in the northeast of Iraq. We have seen that in other places. Turkey is very welcome in the Middle East as a producer, as a trader, as a partner. But once they try to impose their societal or political model on parts of the Middle East, there is a backlash.
There is another question by Jimmy Chong. Going back to what you said right at the beginning of our webinar session, is the current geopolitical situation pre-enable to World War III?
I do not think so. Different reasons. I mean, you can speak about the international system, which is not as bipolar as to allow for a war between two powers. Now we would speak about the US and China, where everybody aligns. Two, China and the US are needing one another much more than their public rhetoric would suggest, and I think they both know it. I mean, have you realized that how much President Trump, who has threatened a trade war, and in a way they are in it, has always backed back again, or went back again, and is looking forward to having a meeting with Xi Jinping, not because, as he says, he loves the guy and it's a great guy, but because in the end, both sides know that they need one another. I would rather, it's a lesser concern, but it's a concern still. I would rather think that in the end, Americans and Chinese and some other great powers will agree that they allow each other to have zones of influence around their countries, which is bad news for countries like Taiwan or for some other smaller countries. But it is not a recipe for World War III.
Thank you very much. A big tragedy is happening in Sudan, and you have been the UN Under-Secretary General for Sudan in 23-24. But we in the West, or probably in the East too, we do not know much about Sudan actually, but it's a real tragedy as far as I know. Can you explain what is happening right now? Is there any solution to this civil war in Sudan?
Well, as long as you have two military leaders and their respective networks intent on leading a war for the power and for the resources of Sudan, and no one is stopping them, it will probably continue. As long as both sides still get arms and finance from outside, they will not easily give up. Even though what we see now is that the army, which is one of the parties, has consolidated its hold over the Nile Valley and the center of Sudan, and the so-called Rapid Support Forces, which is the other party, has consolidated its hold over most of Western Sudan, which is Darfur. And it looks like both sides are intent on eventually dividing the country if they cannot win. And I guess they would both accept that solution once they are too tired or too weak to continue offensives against one another, because they have a tradition in doing that. I mean, I remember in 2011, after a long civil war and attempts of the north of Khartoum to subdue the south of Sudan, they allowed for the separation, and South Sudan became an independent state. So a division of the state where each of the factions does not have to make compromises, but controls the region that they have under their military authority, is not a good solution for Sudan, but it may stop the fighting and may be what both are settling for. For the time being, last sentence on this, we do have regional parties who have influence and who are supporting the two warring sides with arms and finance, but they have not found together in order to impose an end of the fighting on their clients, as it were.
Now, final question, time is up. Summarizing the discussion now, how optimistic actually are you looking at these world?
Look, I'm not in the optimism pessimism game. I'm a policy consultant and a realist. So if I tell policymakers, look, it all looks bad, don't even bother, that's not good advice. So I would say we see a few springs of hope. We see a few opportunities, and let's work on these opportunities and make the chances better to establish or re-establish peace, go for security, and preserve democracy.
Thank you very much, Volker. Time is up, unfortunately. First, I want to thank you very much for your brilliant insights. We are facing disruptions all over, And I believe even disruptors get disrupted. So the message is quite clear: expect the unexpected. So thank you very much again. We wish you all the
My
best.
pleasure, Johnny.
And we are very much looking forward to having you again at STARS event and hopefully at the STARS Symposium in Switzerland next year. Now we are continuing this webinar series on 30th of October. The speaker will be Mona Satfen. She is a strategy consultant based in New York. She was the former White House Deputy Chief of Staff in the Obama administration, and she's also a member of the STARS International Board. Hope to see you then, and goodbye for now. Thank you.